Hey guys, it's Allison, and I am ready to continue making some cards with this February kit from Simon Says Stamp. These are the two cards that I've already made, and I made these pretty quickly because I wanted to test out the embossing folders, which are quite fabulous. I'm very happy with them. And then these are the supplies that I have left. Lots of the 6x6 papers. Obviously the stamp set, the watercolor, the wood veneer, these little gem things, the embossing folders, all the cardstock, and the watercolor piece of paper. So because I've already tested these guys, I thought it would be kind of fun to try and do something with the watercolors. I took my water brush and just sort of wet the paint and smeared it a little bit just so I could see exactly what the colors were. It was a little hard to tell from just the globs of paint. They all looked sort of similar. So there you get a better idea of the different colors. And they coordinate quite nicely with all the papers, obviously. So my watercolor. I admit this was giving me some trouble, so I did go online and get a few ideas from some other crafters who've already used this kit, and one of them used some of these stamped images and embossed them in white and then put the watercolor on top. So I'm going to give that a try and go from there. And I think, yeah, I'm going to use the watercolor.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do to prep my watercolor paper for stamping is to rub it with my little powder pouch. And that is kind of an anti-static tool, I guess. There's lots of different versions on the market. Mine is one that I've had since my Stampin' Up! Days. And it basically ensures that your Versamark ink will go on cleanly and your embossing powder will only stick to that and not any oils on your papers from your fingers or any other sort of damp spots that you've managed to get on there. So I'm picking a few of the smaller images. I've got the paint palette, the tube of paint, and I think the paint brush. And I'm just kind of randomly-ish scattering them around, trying to remember to turn the images so they're not all facing the same way. Really trying to create a very random pattern, which is incredibly hard to do. And then I'm filling in some of the little gaps with the hearts. Now, that's not to say that this whole paper is covered with images. It's not. The other thing I'm doing so that I can actually see the images is I'm sprinkling the embossing powder on in between each stamping, like in between each image stamping, I should say. But I didn't emboss them until the very end. So now they're all embossed and the paper has cooled. And I thought at first that I would put my paint onto my mat and then drip it onto the paper somehow. Then I decided to just drip it directly onto my page. And you can see me here just putting big globs of various colors on there, kind of seeing what will happen. I've put them where the embossed images are. And then I'm trying to move them around the paper, and I got a whole bunch on my mat, so I squished the paper into my mat. It's giving me a very muddied look, though, that I'm not happy with. So I go back with more intense color right onto the paper and let the water wick it all over the place. And I take my heat gun and hit it with a heat gun right off the bat. Now, I think what I should have done, and if I had more paint and more paper, I could do this again and see if it would work. I think I should have dried it in between each paint color, and that would have given me a better image. So that's the finished image, and I'm not loving it, and I'm also not hating it, so I've decided to just embrace it and work with it. But it needs a little something, so I'm taking one of my nested stitched rectangle dies, the biggest size, and the watercolor paper is actually basically the same size as the rectangle that this die would cut out, so I'm just adding the stitched border around it. And then I figure it needs some gold mist. And I've put lots of little droplets on, and then I want to have a couple of big droplets, and I'm trying to move it around a little bit. It doesn't move like the watercolor moves, but it does move a little bit and sort of imitates the watercolor look that I have on the paper already. And it makes me a fair bit happier with the image to begin with, I guess. So now, because it is such a sort of pale image, I think it would get lost with a white card base. So I have pulled out the Audrey Blue cardstock that I have from the kit, which is already cut to, what, 5.5 by 8.5. So I just fold that in half into a top folding card and adhere my watercolor onto it. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was that I normally don't put adhesive into the middle of the card when I'm attaching my papers to my card bases, but because the watercolor paper was quite warped, I really wanted to make sure it stuck all over. So that's why I put that little X of tape in the middle of my card base. So now I'm just looking for things to accent it with, and I have cut out a phrase from one of the pattern papers, and then I found this tiny little stamp on the stamp set that I'm going to add right to the card base as well. And I'm just trying to figure out where to put this. And at the time of recording this voiceover, I cannot remember what that phrase says. So sorry, we're just going to have to look at the close-ups when they come. So the last thing I'm going to do is add some of these pink jewels. And I am going to use, I have this tiny little bottle of Ranger Matte Medium. And I'm just finding a needle so that I can unclog it. And I'm using that to put little dots of glue around. It's got a finer nozzle than the glue that I normally use. And since the glue that came in the kit is all gunky, this is my next best option. And then I'm just using, I don't think I talked about this tool in the last video. This is, I think it's a silhouette tool. And it allows you, it's got kind of like a blue tack, you know, the stuff that you would hang posters up on your wall that doesn't leave a mark. It's got kind of that at the end, and it allows you to pick up sequins and like little dots and this kind of thing and lay them down in your glue. So that one's done. I've set it aside to dry, and I'll go through all the cards I made at the very end with close-ups. And so I'm working on my next one. And since I'd already cut into that paper that has all the different words and sort of sayings and images and that sort of thing on it, I decide to use that next. And I'm going to make the base out of the orange, which has a subtle sort of tone-on-tone polka dot on it. And then I'm going to cut a big wide strip of all those sayings and just put it straight across. The other thing I did was grabbed a bunch of white heavy stock, cardstock from my stash, and pre-made some white card bases. So some are landscape and some are portrait orientation. This particular card is landscape orientation, so I have grabbed one of those. And I always like to cut my background papers so you get that little frame of the white card base in the back. And then I cut the longer strip so that it spans the whole card, so it crosses over onto the white. And now I've actually taken the back of that paper, which has a very soft polka dot, and I'm stamping my image onto that. And I'm just using a slightly darker blue than I did for previous cards. The blue I used in the previous cards was Tempting Turquoise from Stampin' Up, and it works, but it was a little bit light, and I figured because the colors in this card are so much brighter that I needed a darker blue. So this one is actually my favorite blue from Stampin' Up. It's called Island Indigo, and so that's what I have used to stamp the sentiment there. And now I am just looking for ways to accent it, and I want to use one of these wood veneers, and I figure I can use that spool, the thread spool, and I've found some wood buttons in my stash. And what I want to do is actually wrap the spool with some embroidery floss, and then use the same floss in the buttons to pretend like they're sewn on. They're just going to be glued on, but I can put buttons or put embroidery thread through the holes, and it will mimic that they've been sewed on. So I'm just trying to figure out which buttons I want to use on there. So I've got 3 wood buttons right now. One has a black frame around, I guess, rim. One is plain, and one has a red flower in the middle. So I thread the plain one with the pink embroidery floss, but I'm not convinced that the other 2 are really going to work on this card. They seem a bit big and they sort of dominate. So I'm looking through my little stash of buttons to see what else I can find, and I eventually find this really small wood button. And so I just quickly put some floss through that little button and get that one adhered to my card. Okay, so that one's done, and now it's time to start on the next one. So I'm just working my way down through my stack of pattern paper. So my next paper is this one with the typewriters on it. And I'm going to do something quite similar to the previous card. So I have this hot pink pattern. It's got kind of a graph, not kind of, it's got a graph pattern on it. And I take a strip of the typewriters, a narrower strip than I used of all the crafty words. And then the back of the typewriter pattern has a like an alphabet in typewriter keys. So I cut a little square of that to layer up behind. And then I had stamped my sentiment on white cardstock to test out my ink just before on the previous card. So I decided to use that, but I cut it out with one of my nested rectangular, stitched rectangular dies, whatever you want to call them. And the bottom is not perfect, but I can tuck it behind the strip of typewriters. So it's sort of peeking up as if somebody was typing on it, basically. And I've put dimensional adhesive on the top of that to further accentuate that effect. So now I'm putting my card together, and I adhere the typewriters down and try and tuck the little square in behind it, and realize that I should have adhered that first because it's a little bit too tall, so I have to trim it off and then get it in. And now I am putting in my sentiment, but it does need a little bit something else. So I think about it for a while, and I'm wondering if I should use some of the wood veneer, but it doesn't feel right. If there was a typewriter in there, I totally would have put it on there, but there isn't. So on the stamp set is a little sentiment that says something like hugs enclosed or something like that, and I figure that's good enough with some gold mist to finish the card. And then we move on to the next one. And since I've done 2 landscape orientation, I decided it's time to switch it up. And I've got this piece of teal and then the stripy pattern, and I want to use one of the wood veneers on there. And I want to have a different sentiment this time because I've used the same sentiment a couple of times. So I'm going to layer 2 sentiments together, the "You Make Life More Colorful" and the "Thanks." And I'm going to stamp them on the hot pink that I used on the previous card. And I will just cut that out and layer it up. So my blue is 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. That will give me my white frame of card base around the back. And then instead of having that stripe pattern run the full length of the card, be 5.5 inches long, I am actually going to have it's about 5 1/8 maybe, so that I can have a frame of the blue around. And then I've adhered my pink stamped sentiment, and now I am looking for the wood veneer to put on there. And I wanted to use the camera, but it is a little bit big for where I have placed my sentiment. So I am going back into my button stash, and 2 of the buttons that I had pulled out for one of the previous cards have made it onto this card, the one with the red flower and then the one with the black rim. And then I found a 3rd wood button, and it's got a more colorful flower on it. So that's the one I'm going to have right by the sentiment, the part that says "You Make Life More Colorful." So I'm using the same pink embroidery floss, and I'm going to stick all those buttons onto the card. And then again, some gold mist, and that one is done. You can see with this watercolor one that the paper is a little bit warped still, despite my extra adhesive. So I am going to have to try and flatten that somehow underneath something heavy. But here's the other close-ups of the other cards, and you can just see all the little details on those. Okay guys, thank you so much for joining me today. So I've now made 6 cards from this kit, and I will continue until basically all my papers are gone. Stay tuned, and I will post all the other cards that I make. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.